Welcome to the channel, my alien friends. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Enjoy listening. The void of space stretched endlessly before Evan Rivers as he sat in the cockpit of his cargo ship, the Solace. His ship, though modest by Earth fleet standards, had been his sanctuary for years. Drifting from port to port, delivering goods to the farthest reaches of human-colonized space, Evan found comfort in the isolation, in the hum of the ship's engines and the steady rhythm of his routine. But today, something felt different. Docked at a desolate outpost on the edge of the known galaxy, Evan had been on edge since they'd arrived. The station felt too quiet, too abandoned. After resupplying, he was ready to push off and leave the eeriness behind. Yet something or someone had already altered his plans. As the ship prepared for departure, a subtle ping from the cargo bay's motion sensors flickered across his console. Evan frowned. The cargo had been secured. There shouldn't be anything moving down there. His hand instinctively hovered near the pistol at his side as he descended the metal stairs into the bowels of the ship. "Show yourself," he growled, stepping into the dim light of the cargo hold, his voice a sharp echo in the silence. For a moment, nothing stirred, just the low creak of the ship adjusting to its surroundings. But then, from behind a stack of crates, a figure emerged, slight and trembling, yet unmistakably humanoid. His eyes widened, a rare sight in this corner of space. She stepped forward cautiously, her movements fluid and graceful. Her skin shimmered with a faint greenish glow, catching the dim lights of the hold and reflecting them like stardust on the waves of an alien sea. Her hair, long and silver, cascaded down her back, almost glowing in the half-darkness. But it was her eyes that caught his attention the most, large, luminous, and brimming with both fear and something deeper, something dangerous. "I mean no harm," she said softly, her voice low and melodic. "Please let me explain." Evan's grip tightened on his weapon, but he didn't raise it. "Who are you, and how the hell did you get on my ship?" The woman paused, her chest rising and falling as if she was steadying herself. "My name is Lenara. I boarded your vessel back at the outpost. I had no other choice." "No choice?" you could have asked. His tone was sharp, his suspicion palpable. "What are you running from?" Her eyes flickered with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Sadness, or perhaps, "I'm running from my people. I'm running from my people, from a life of control, exploitation." She stepped forward, and despite himself, Evan didn't move. "I need passage. If I stay, they will find me. And She stopped herself, her gaze dropping as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. Evan's mind raced. He'd heard stories of the Ethians, strange, ethereal beings from the outer systems. Rarely seen, rarely trusted. If half the rumors were true, she could be trouble, a magnet for unwanted attention from powerful forces. But she was also alone, vulnerable. And there was something else. She wasn't just asking for passage. The way she looked at him with that intense gaze hinted at something deeper. A strange pull gripped him, an inexplicable curiosity he couldn't shake. "Why should I help you?" he asked, voice low and skeptical. "What's in it for me?" Lenara's gaze lifted, locking onto his, her eyes shimmering in the dim light. "I can be useful to you. I can work, clean, cook, help navigate, whatever you need. But more than that." She stepped closer, her presence almost intoxicating now. "I can protect you. I have abilities. I can sense dangers before they happen. Please let me stay." For a moment, Evan was silent. His survival instincts screamed at him to refuse, to toss her out at the next stop. But those same instincts were being overridden by something else. An inexplicable, growing desire to know more about this alien woman who had somehow invaded his ship. And his thoughts. His grip on the pistol loosened. "Fine," he said after a long pause, "but you pull anything, and I'll put you out the airlock myself. Understood?" Lenara nodded quickly, her face lighting up with relief, even as she maintained her poise. "Thank you," she whispered. "You won't regret this." Evan turned and began to lead her out of the cargo hold, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. As they walked through the corridors, he could feel her presence behind him, quiet and graceful, yet unnervingly close. In the days that followed, Lenara made herself useful as promised. She worked with an efficiency that surprised him, and there was something about her presence that shifted the energy aboard the ship. It wasn't just her beauty, though it was undeniable. It was her calmness, the way she seemed to anticipate what the ship needed, what he needed. But at night, as the ship sailed through the darkness of space, Evan found himself unable to sleep. His thoughts kept drifting back to her strange, glowing eyes, her soft, musical voice, the way her skin seemed to catch the light and hold it just a moment longer than normal. What exactly had he let aboard his ship? And more importantly, why couldn't he bring himself to regret it? Days passed in an eerie calm aboard the Solace, but Evan could feel the tension building, like the quiet before a storm. Lenara had integrated seamlessly into the ship's routine, yet there was an unsettling quality to her presence, as if she were more than just a passenger. She moved with a silent grace through the corridors, her every action precise, almost too controlled. No task was too mundane for her. She cleaned, cooked, even helped with minor repairs. But the more useful she became, the more Evan couldn't shake the feeling that she was observing, waiting for something. And then there were the glances. At first they were fleeting. Her luminous eyes would meet his for just a moment longer than necessary, her gaze soft but charged with a strange intensity. But soon, those moments grew more frequent, more deliberate. Evan wasn't a man easily swayed by beauty, let alone one from another world, but Lenara had a way of looking at him that stirred something deep within, something primal. It was late one night when things began to shift. The ship hummed quietly as it cut through the endless black of space, the stars outside a distant blur. Evan had just finished checking the navigation systems and was heading toward the galley when he found her there, standing alone, bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lights. Her back was to him, the faint shimmer of her green skin catching his eye. But it was the air around her that made him stop. She turned slowly as if she had sensed him the moment he entered. Her silver hair cascaded down her back, framing her slender form like a celestial waterfall. Her eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto his with a gaze that seemed to see right through him. There was no mistaking the look this time. Desire, raw and unspoken, radiated from her in waves. "Evan," she said softly, his name on her lips like a caress. He swallowed, suddenly feeling the tightness in his chest, the heat rising to his skin. "What are you doing here?" His voice sounded more gruff than he intended, but he had to keep control, to hold on to the barriers he had built between them. She smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips that sent a shiver down his spine. "Waiting," she replied, her voice low, almost a whisper. She took a step closer, the distance between them shrinking, and Evan's pulse quickened. "For what?" he asked, though he knew the answer. He could feel it in the way her presence seemed to fill the room, in the way her eyes traced the lines of his face, his body, as if she were mapping him in her mind. "For you." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made his breath hitch. She took another step forward, close enough now that he could feel the faint coolness radiating from her skin, the scent of something unfamiliar yet intoxicating filling the air. "Lenara," he started, his voice faltering. He should tell her to stop, to put distance between them, but the words stuck in his throat. Her hand moved before he could react, light as a feather as it rested on his chest, the touch sending a surge of electricity through him. He hadn't realized how much he craved contact until her fingers brushed against his skin, a soft caress that seemed to ignite every nerve. "Why do you resist?" she asked, her eyes searching his, filled with a strange blend of curiosity and hunger. "You want this. I can feel it." Evan's jaw clenched. He could barely breathe, let alone think. Her touch was undoing him, unraveling his resolve piece by piece. He had been alone for so long, by choice, by necessity. But now, with Lenara so close, it was like his body had remembered something it had long forgotten. She leaned in, her breath cool against his neck, her lips just inches from his skin. "You feel it too, don't you? The connection. It's not just physical, Evan." Her words were like a spell, wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into her orbit. "Let go." His heart thundered in his chest, and for a moment he almost did. The temptation to surrender was overwhelming, to let her pull him into whatever strange magnetic force she wielded. But something in the back of his mind fought back, a small but stubborn voice of caution. "What are you doing to me?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm not doing anything you don't want," she purred, her lips brushing against his ear. "But there's so much more I can show you. You've barely scratched the surface of what I am, of what we could be." Evan's hand moved reflexively, gripping her wrist, trying to steady himself, to regain control. But the touch only deepened the connection between them, and he felt it. The strange energy that hummed just beneath her skin, pulsing in time with his own racing heart. It was like nothing he'd ever felt before, something both foreign and achingly familiar. He looked down into her eyes, and for the first time, he saw beyond the seduction. There was something more in her gaze, something deeper, desperation perhaps, or need. A need for him, not just as a man, but as something more, something essential. "I don't know if I can trust you," he murmured, though his grip on her remained firm. Lenara's expression softened, but her gaze never wavered. "Trust has nothing to do with it, Evan. This is about what we feel, what we are." For a long moment, the two stood there, suspended in the quiet of the ship, the universe moving around them. But in that space, Only the two of them existed. The boundaries between them had blurred. But the question of what came next lingered, heavy and dangerous. Evan didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing. Lenara wasn't like anything he had ever known. And part of him, no matter how much he fought it, wanted to see where this strange, irresistible connection would take him. Chapter 3. Unraveling Desire. The ship was quiet, the vast emptiness of space stretching out beyond the solace like an endless black sea. The hum of the engines provided the only steady sound, but it felt distant, muted, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. Evan sat in his quarters, staring at the stars through the small window, but his mind wasn't on the stars. It was on her. Lenara, the alien temptress who had slipped into his life like a shadow, lingering at the edges of his thoughts, even when she wasn't near. He couldn't shake her. Didn't want to, if he was honest with himself. He rubbed his hand across his face as if the physical action could clear his mind, but the tension in his body only seemed to coil tighter. She was doing something to him. He could feel it. Every glance, every word she spoke in that soft, alluring voice seemed to dig under his skin, pulling him deeper into whatever strange gravity she exuded. And yet, he wasn't resisting. Not really. A soft knock came at the door, startling him out of his thoughts. His pulse quickened even before the door slid open, revealing the figure he'd been thinking about. Lenara stepped inside, her presence seeming to fill the room instantly. She was dressed in a simple sleeveless tunic, but on her, it looked regal, almost otherworldly. Her glowing eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. The unspoken tension that had been building between them for days now hung thick in the air, charged like static before a storm. "Evan," she said softly, her voice like silk, slipping into the space between them. "Why do you hide from me?" "I'm not hiding," he replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "You are? You've been keeping yourself at a distance. But I feel what's happening between us. You feel it too, don't you?" He didn't answer right away, but his silence was an answer in itself. Lenara took a step closer, her movements slow, deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. Evan felt his breath hitch in his throat, his heart beginning to race as she came closer, the space between them shrinking until he could feel the cool energy radiating from her skin. "I don't want to hurt you, Evan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just want to understand this connection between us." "I don't even know what this is," he admitted, his voice low, rough with tension. "Desire," she said simply, her eyes glowing brighter. "But it's more than that. You feel it too. This bond, this pull between us. It's stronger than either of us can explain." Her hand reached out, light as a feather, resting against his chest. The moment she touched him, Evan felt a jolt of energy shoot through his body, the intensity of it almost overwhelming. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that seemed to touch his very soul. "I don't know if I can trust you," he murmured, echoing the same words he'd spoken before. But even as he said it, his body betrayed him, leaning into her touch. "You don't have to trust me," she whispered, her breath cool against his skin. "You just have to feel." Evan closed his eyes, as if to shut out the reality of what was happening, but the moment he did, her presence enveloped him entirely. Her other hand slid up his arm, and before he could stop himself, he pulled her against him, his fingers gripping her waist as if she were the only thing keeping him grounded in the vast emptiness around them. Their lips met in a crash of urgency and heat, the kiss igniting something in both of them that had been simmering just below the surface. Lenara's lips were cool against his, but her kiss burned with a fire that left him breathless, his pulse roaring in his ears as he lost himself in her. The ship, the stars, the world outside of this room seemed to fade away as they moved together, a tangle of limbs and suppressed moans. Evan's hands roamed her body, discovering the unfamiliar yet intoxicating texture of her skin. Every touch ignited her in ways he couldn't have predicted, her body arching, responding to him as if they had been made for each other. Lenara's hands, cool and soft, trailed down his chest, her touch leaving a trail of electric heat in its wake. The intensity of it all, the desire, the connection, the unspoken need, was more than he had ever felt before, like she was pulling him into her very soul, binding them together in a way he couldn't explain. When they finally joined, it was as if the universe itself had aligned. A fusion of human and alien, their bodies and souls intertwined in a way that felt both primal and sacred. There was no space between them, no hesitation, just raw, unbridled need. Time lost its meaning. The ship around them, the endless stars beyond the walls, everything dissolved into the heat of their connection. And when it was over, Evan lay there, his chest rising and falling as he held her close, her cool skin a soothing balm against his own overheated flesh. He had no words, no thoughts, only the overwhelming sense that something had shifted between them, something profound. He looked down at her, at the way her eyes, still glowing faintly, gazed back at him, filled with something unspoken, something more than lust. But the deeper truth lingered in the air, unsaid but understood. Whatever had happened between them was only the beginning. As Lenara rested against him, her breathing steady and calm, Evan's thoughts raced. This was more than desire, more than a fleeting moment of passion. He could feel it, deep in his bones. He had crossed a line, one he could never come back from, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Evan awoke to the soft, rhythmic hum of the Solace, the ever-present vibration of the ship's engines lulling him back to a sense of reality. But the warmth beside him wasn't the hum of machinery. It was Lenara, curled against his side, her cool skin a sharp contrast to his own. Her presence, once foreign and unsettling, now felt like gravity, anchoring him in a way he had never expected. He turned his head slightly, watching her as she slept. In the dim light, her iridescent skin shimmered faintly, catching the faint glow of the stars outside. Her silver hair fanned out across the pillow, soft and unearthly, and her lips, slightly parted, formed the slightest hint of a smile. It was a moment of calm, of peace, and yet, Evan's mind raced, the events of the last few days spinning like a broken reel. The passion they'd shared had shaken him, not just physically, but emotionally. It had been more than just desire. It had been a union that went beyond flesh and heat. There had been something in that moment, an exchange of energy, of something intangible that had bound them together. And now that bond felt like a weight around his chest. He eased himself out of the bed, careful not to wake her, and stood by the window, staring out into the blackness of space. His reflection stared back at him, tired and conflicted. He couldn't deny what he felt, an undeniable connection to her, as if his soul had somehow intertwined with hers. But that connection came with consequences, ones he wasn't sure he was prepared for. His hand absent-mindedly grazed the side of his chest, where a faint scar now rested, the mark left from where their energies had fused. The moment had been transcendent, a merging of human and alien in a way he had never thought possible. But in its wake, it left questions he couldn't ignore any longer. Lenara stirred behind him, her eyes fluttering open as she stretched languidly on the bed. She turned her head, and when their eyes met, Evan felt that pull again, that strange magnetic force that had drawn him to her from the start. It was stronger now, impossible to deny, and yet filled him with unease. She rose, slipping silently out of the bed, her movement fluid and graceful. She approached him, her bare feet padding softly across the cold floor, and without a word, wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his back. "I can feel it," she whispered, her voice a quiet melody against his skin. He closed his eyes. "Feel what?" "The bond," she replied, her fingers tracing light circles along his ribs. "What we share. It's not just physical, Evan. It's something deeper. You feel it too, don't you?" He exhaled, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Of course he felt it. How could he not? It was in every look, every touch, in the way his thoughts were constantly drawn back to her no matter how hard he tried to push her from his mind. But what unsettled him wasn't just the bond itself, it was what it meant. "What did we do, Lenara?" His voice was low, almost a growl, betraying the fear creeping into his chest. "What did we create?" Lenara pulled back slightly, her luminous eyes searching his, and for the first time he saw something in them he hadn't noticed before: vulnerability. "I told you," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "My people, we don't reproduce the way humans do. Our connections are formed through energy, through merging our essences. What happened between us, Evan, it was more than just physical. It was a union of our beings, a creation of life." His chest tightened, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Are you saying?" She nodded, her hand coming to rest on her stomach, where a faint glow now pulsed, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "I'm pregnant, with a child that is part of both of us." The room felt as though it had collapsed in on itself. Evan stared at her, his mind reeling, trying to process the gravity of her words. A child, a hybrid, something that was both human and alien, a fusion of two worlds that were never meant to collide. He backed away, the air suddenly thick and suffocating. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. I can't. "I didn't plan this," Lenara whispered, her voice filled with pain. "I didn't expect to feel this way for you, to be so deeply connected. But it happened, Evan, and now we're bound, in ways neither of us fully understand." He wanted to argue, to fight against the truth of her words, but he couldn't. The bond was there, undeniable and unbreakable. He felt it in his bones, in the way his heart seemed to beat in rhythm with hers. But with that bond came danger, because this child, this hybrid, was more than just the product of their union. It was a target, a threat to both their worlds. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse, filled with a mixture of fear and awe. Lenara stepped forward, her hand finding his. "Now, we face whatever comes, together." Evan swallowed hard, the weight of their new reality settling in. There was no going back. The bond between them had created something powerful, something dangerous, and with that danger came a new purpose, protecting the life they had unintentionally created. The bond between them had become both their greatest strength and their greatest risk. The silence between them had become unbearable. Days passed in a thick tension aboard the Solace, each moment heavier than the last. Evan could feel the distance growing between him and Lenara, a chasm he couldn't cross, even if he wanted to. But the bond was still there, ever present, pulling at him in ways he could hardly comprehend. Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of the life growing inside her, his child, their child, and the terrifying implications that came with it. He paced the ship's bridge, unable to settle, his thoughts circling the same question. What should he do? Every decision felt like a betrayal, of himself, of Lenara, of everything he had known before she had entered his life. He'd never asked for this. He was a simple cargo captain, a man who lived on the fringes of the galaxy, avoiding complications. And now, his life was nothing but complications, wrapped in the form of a beautiful alien who had turned everything upside down. Lenara sat in the galley, her back to him, seemingly oblivious to his turmoil. She had withdrawn over the last few days, as if sensing the shift in him. Her silver hair shimmered in the soft light, falling over her shoulders, her stillness unnerving. She hadn't said much since revealing her pregnancy, but Evan could feel her emotions swirling beneath the surface. Fear, hope, and something else he couldn't quite name. Trust, perhaps. But trust was a fragile thing. As much as he wanted to believe in this strange connection between them, a deeper voice gnawed at him, telling him that this was a mistake, that she had used him, manipulated him with her alien allure, and now he was trapped in a situation he couldn't control. She had come aboard his ship as a stowaway, a fugitive running from her own people. How could he trust someone who had deceived him from the beginning? His hand hovered over the ship's comms, hesitating before he finally activated the console. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment he simply stared at it, the weight of the decision pulling him in two directions. He could call Earth's authorities. Report her. Turn her in. It would be easy. Cut ties, hand her over to those who knew how to deal with alien threats, and be done with it. They could take her, take the child, and he could go back to his life. No more complications. No more danger. But the very thought of it made his chest tighten with an ache he couldn't explain. The idea of losing her, of turning her over to people who would likely dissect her and their unborn child as a curiosity, as a weapon, it made his stomach churn. Evan? Lenara's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts, and he turned to find her standing in the doorway, her eyes soft but filled with concern. What are you doing? He hesitated, his hand still resting near the comms. I was just thinking. Her eyes flicked to the screen, and in an instant her expression changed. Fear, raw and sharp, flashed across her face. You were going to call them, weren't you? Earth's authorities. Evan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The guilt in his silence spoke louder than words ever could. Lenara stepped forward, her movements quick, her glowing eyes narrowing with hurt and betrayal. You were going to turn me in. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. I don't know what else to do, he admitted, his voice hoarse. This is too much, Lenara. I'm just a captain. A nobody. I'm not prepared for this. For a child. For the danger that comes with you. Her face tightened, the shimmer of her skin dulling as her emotions swirled into something darker. You think I wanted this? To be hunted? To have no choice but to run? To cling to someone who might betray me at any moment? Her voice shook with anger, but beneath it, Evan heard the pain. You think I don't feel the same fear? That I'm not terrified of what's coming? He opened his mouth to speak, but she didn't give him the chance. I trusted you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I chose you, Evan, and now I'm carrying your child, our child. But you're ready to hand us over to them, aren't you? To let them take me away like I'm nothing more than a science experiment. Her words cut him deeper than he'd expected, and he hated himself for the truth in them. He had considered it, and yet, here she was, standing before him, vulnerable in ways he couldn't fathom. She had chosen him, trusted him with her life and the life growing inside her, and he was about to betray that trust. Lenara's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time, Evan realized how fragile she truly was. Not because of her alien nature, but because, like him, she was caught in something far bigger than either of them had ever anticipated. Something neither of them knew how to handle. "I don't want to betray you," Evan said softly, stepping forward. "But I don't know how to protect you." She shook her head, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "You don't need to protect me. You just need to believe in us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Evan felt the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. He had been running from it, from the responsibility, from the bond that tied them together. But there was no more running. Not now. Not ever. Slowly, Evan reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, and the moment they touched, he felt it again. That connection, that undeniable force that pulled them together. He wasn't just responsible for her. He was bound to her, to the child, to their future, whatever it might be. "I believe in us," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Lenara's hand tightened around his, and in that moment, the tension between them began to ease. The fear, the betrayal. It was still there, lingering, but now there was something stronger. Hope. The atmosphere aboard the Solace had shifted into something thick and electric, like the air before a violent storm. The quiet that once filled the ship was now laced with a tension that Evan couldn't shake. Ever since their confrontation, ever since he had chosen to stay with Lenara, their bond had grown stronger, more intense. But with that growing connection came something else, something darker. Lenara's powers were becoming unstable. At first, it was subtle. A light flickering here, a gentle hum that vibrated through the ship's systems when she walked by. But as the days passed, those small incidents began to escalate. A wrench on the floor would suddenly shoot across the room, as if pulled by an invisible force. The ship's gravity would flicker, leaving them weightless for moments before snapping back into place. It wasn't intentional. Lenara's abilities seemed to be slipping beyond her control. Evan found her in the engine room, staring out into space through a viewport, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the cold metal railing. He could feel the disturbance in the air around her, like a static charge just waiting to burst. "Lenara," he called softly, stepping toward her. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. Her gaze was fixed on the stars beyond, her silver hair flowing like liquid light around her shoulders. "I don't know how to stop it," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "It's getting worse." Evan stopped just behind her, his heart aching at the sight of her so vulnerable. He had seen her power, the strength she possessed, but this was something different, something dangerous. "Hey," he said gently, reaching out to place a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out." She shook her head, her shoulders tense. "I can't control it, Evan. The closer the child comes to being born, the more unstable I become. My body, it's not just mine anymore. It's like the energy inside me is tearing me apart." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. He had known her pregnancy was different, that their child would be something new, something powerful. But he hadn't realized the toll it was taking on her. He hadn't understood the full extent of the danger they were in. "We can get help," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There are people out there who—" "No." Her voice was sharp, and she turned to face him, her glowing eyes filled with fear and determination. "No one can help me. Not now. If they find out what I am, what we are, they'll take me. Take the child. They'll treat us like experiments." Evan's stomach twisted at the thought. He had already come close to making that mistake himself, but now the reality of what could happen felt too real, too close. He couldn't let that happen. Not to her, not to their child. "We'll find another way," he promised, his hand tightening on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out together." But as the words left his mouth, a sudden tremor ran through the ship. The lights flickered violently, and the floor beneath them shook as if the very fabric of the Solace was coming apart. Lenara gasped, clutching her stomach, her eyes wide with panic. "It's happening again," she whispered, her voice trembling. I can't stop it." Evan's heart pounded as he looked around, the ship groaning under the pressure of her power. He had to do something, anything, before it tore them apart. "Lenara, listen to me," he said urgently, grabbing her by both shoulders. "You can control it. You're stronger than this. You just have to focus." Tears welled up in her glowing eyes, her body trembling under the weight of the power coursing through her. "I don't know how," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's too much. I can't hold it in." Evan felt a surge of helplessness, but he couldn't give in to it. Not now. "Look at me," he demanded, his voice firm but gentle. "Look at me, Lenara." Slowly, her gaze met his, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice low but steady. "We're connected. Whatever you're feeling, I'm feeling it too. Let me help you." She shook her head, but he tightened his grip on her shoulders. Let me in, Lenara. Trust me. For a moment she hesitated, her eyes searching his, as if she were trying to decide whether to let him into the chaos that raged inside her. And then, with a shaky breath, she nodded. Evan pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, feeling the energy vibrating through her body, threatening to explode. He could feel it now, the raw, untamed force that she was struggling to contain. It was like a storm inside her, wild and relentless, ready to tear everything apart. But together, they stood at the eye of the storm. And in that moment, Evan realized something. The bond between them wasn't just a connection of emotions, of love. It was a channel, a way for them to share the weight of the power Lenara carried. "Focus on me," he whispered into her hair, his heart racing. "Let it flow through me." Slowly, painfully, he felt the energy shift. It wasn't perfect. He wasn't built to handle what she carried. But it was enough. The trembling of the ship began to ease, the light stopped flickering, and the pressure in the air lessened. Lenara's body sagged against his, exhausted but calmer, the storm inside her finally subsiding, for now. As they stood together in the dimly lit engine room, Evan realized just how fragile their situation had become. The power inside Lenara and inside their unborn child was growing, and with it, the danger. How long could they hold it off before it consumed them both? Evan didn't know the answer. But he knew one thing. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The stars outside the Solace seemed to shimmer with a cold, distant indifference as Evan paced the narrow confines of the bridge. His mind raced, turning over 100 different outcomes, each more dangerous than the last. They had barely survived the last surge of Lenara's power, and now, with every passing moment, the danger grew more palpable. Her energy was becoming too much to contain, and with her pregnancy advancing faster than either of them had anticipated, time was running out. Evan's grip tightened around the console, the weight of responsibility bearing down on him. He had promised to protect her, to protect their child, but now their situation felt like an inevitable trap closing in. There were forces in the galaxy that would stop at nothing to take Lenara and their unborn hybrid, and one of those forces had just found them. "They're hailing us," Naomi's voice crackled over the intercom, a note of urgency in her usually calm tone. Evan turned, his heart sinking as the proximity alarms blared, filling the bridge with a sense of impending doom. "What do they want?" Evan growled, though he already knew. The answer was always the same. They wanted Lenara. Naomi paused, her fingers flying over the control panel. "It's a Martian patrol ship. They're broadcasting an urgent message, something about a fugitive aboard." Evan's blood ran cold. They were here for Lenara. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He knew this moment was coming. It was inevitable, but the fear still gripped him. This wasn't just a patrol. The Martians had advanced technology, ships far more powerful than his aging freighter. If they boarded the Solace, it would be over. "What do we do?" Naomi asked, her voice tight. The weight of the decision hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Evan hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. He could feel Lenara's presence behind him before he saw her. She stood in the doorway, her face pale but resolute, her glowing eyes filled with a determination that sent a jolt through him. "They're here for me," she said softly, her voice steady despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. "If we run, they'll just keep hunting us." "We're not running," Evan replied, the conviction in his voice surprising even him. "I won't let them take you." Lenara's lips trembled, and she crossed the room to stand beside him, her hand finding his. The touch sent a warmth through him, grounding him even as the tension built. "They'll destroy you, Evan," she whispered, her voice filled with an ache that broke his heart. "You don't have to die for me." His jaw clenched. "I'm not dying for you. We're getting through this, together." The comm screen flickered to life, and a sharp, authoritative voice filled the room. "This is Captain Thorne of the Martian Congressional Republic Navy. We know you're harboring a fugitive. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will be met with force." Evan's hands shook with rage. His gaze flicked to Lenara, and in that moment, he made his choice. "Naomi," he said, his voice firm. "Take us into the asteroid belt. Use the rocks for cover. We're not letting them get close enough to board." Lenara's eyes widened, fear flashing in them. "Evan, that's suicide. Their ship is faster, more maneuverable. We don't have a choice," he cut in. "We can't fight them head on, but we might be able to outmaneuver them. We'll use the asteroid field to our advantage. If we stay close to the rocks, it'll mess with their targeting systems." Her hand tightened around his, her expression a mixture of fear and trust. "I'm with you," she whispered. Naomi didn't hesitate. The ship lurched forward as she diverted full power to the engines, plunging the Solace into the heart of the dense asteroid field. Massive chunks of rock loomed ahead, the debris shifting and spinning in an unpredictable dance. Evan's hands flew over the controls, his heart hammering in his chest as he navigated through the treacherous terrain. Behind them, the Martian ship followed, its sleek silhouette closing in fast. The proximity alarms shrieked again, louder this time as the enemy ship began firing. Blasts of energy shot past them, narrowly missing the ship, scorching the edges of nearby asteroids. "They're gaining on us," Naomi shouted over the roar of the engines. "Shields are taking a hit, Captain." Evan cursed under his breath. "Keep us moving. We need to stay close to the rocks." Suddenly the ship shuddered violently, nearly knocking him off his feet. He glanced at the monitors. One of the blasts had grazed the ship's hull. A warning light blinked ominously. Another hit like that, and they'd be dead in the water. "Evan," Lenara whispered, her voice filled with panic. "It's not enough. They're too fast." He knew she was right. They couldn't outrun the Martians forever. The gap was closing, and soon enough, there would be nowhere left to hide. But then, as his mind raced, a dangerous thought flickered into existence. "I can stop them," Lenara said, as if reading his thoughts. "If I use my power, I can create a gravitational well, something to throw them off course." But Evan's heart pounded. He knew the risks. She had barely been able to control her power before, and now, with her energy becoming more unstable, the act of creating something that massive could tear her apart. "No," he said firmly. "I won't let you." "I have to," she interrupted, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "If we don't stop them, we're dead. Let me do this." Evan stared at her, torn between the love that surged in his chest and the overwhelming fear of losing her. But in her eyes, he saw something more than fear. He saw courage, determination, and love. "Do it," he whispered, the words barely audible. Lenara closed her eyes, her face a mask of concentration. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then a deep, rumbling hum vibrated through the ship, growing louder and more intense. Evan watched in awe as the stars outside the viewport seemed to warp, space itself bending under the force of Lenara's power. Suddenly, the Martian ship veered off course, its trajectory spiraling out of control. The gravitational well Lenara had created pulled at the vessel like an unseen hand, dragging it into the asteroid field with a violent force. The last thing Evan saw before the Martian ship disappeared behind a cluster of massive rocks was the bright flare of an explosion as it collided with an asteroid. Silence fell over the bridge. Evan turned to Lenara, but she was already collapsing into his arms, her body limp, her skin pale and shimmering with exhaustion. "You did it," he whispered, holding her close as relief and fear warred within him. But even as they floated in the fragile safety of the asteroid field, Evan knew this was only the beginning. The Martians weren't the only ones after Lenara. The real fight was still ahead, and the bond between them would be tested in ways they had yet to imagine. The silence in the aftermath of battle was always the loudest. The Solace drifted through the asteroid belt, its systems barely holding together after the skirmish with the Martians. Evan sat on the floor of the bridge, cradling Lenara in his arms. She was breathing, but her body was fragile and cold, her usual shimmering glow dimmed to a faint pulse beneath her skin. He could feel the weight of her exhaustion in every shallow breath she took. "You did it," he whispered, brushing a stray strand of her silver hair from her face. "You saved us." Her eyes fluttered open, heavy with fatigue. She looked up at him, her luminous gaze soft, filled with a mixture of relief and pain. "I didn't do it alone," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "We did it together." Evan felt his chest tighten, his heart hammering against his ribs as he held her closer, afraid to let her go, afraid that if he did, she might slip away completely. The bond between them, forged in passion, trust, and danger, felt stronger now than ever, yet more fragile than he'd imagined. He could feel her energy, faint but steady, like a flicker of light fighting to stay alive in the overwhelming darkness. "We're not out of this yet," he said quietly, forcing his voice to stay calm. "We need to get out of this asteroid field, get you to safety." But Lenara shook her head, a weak smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "There's nowhere safe," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Not for us, not for the child. The child. Their child." The life growing inside her, born from their impossible connection. It wasn't just a reminder of what they had shared, it was a symbol of everything they had fought for. A future neither of them had expected, but one that now held more weight than anything they had known before. "I'll find somewhere," Evan said, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't let fear paralyze him now. "We'll disappear if we have to, go off-grid. The Martians, Earth, none of them will find us." Lenara reached up, her cool fingers brushing against his cheek, her touch sending a wave of warmth through him. "We can't run forever, Evan," she whispered. This isn't just about us anymore. Our child, they'll come for her. For what she represents, she's more than a hybrid. She's a new beginning. Evan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a suffocating blanket. He had always known that their child would be special, different. But now, the reality of what that meant was sinking in. Their daughter would be hunted, not just because of her mixed heritage, but because of the power she would carry. A power that could reshape everything they knew about the universe. But even in the face of that overwhelming truth, Evan felt something stir inside him. Not fear. Not despair. But hope. It was fragile, like the first breath of air after drowning, but it was there, a flicker of possibility in the vast darkness that surrounded them. "We won't run," he said, his voice stronger now, more certain. We'll fight for her, for us." Lenara's eyes softened, her expression filled with something deeper than gratitude, something closer to love. "I knew," she whispered, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "From the moment I stepped onto your ship, I knew you were the one who could help me, the one I could trust. And now, I know you're the one who can protect her." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet space between them. "We'll protect her," he murmured, "together." The quiet of the moment stretched out, filled with unspoken promises and a deep, shared understanding of what lay ahead. But it was broken by a sudden, gentle pulse of energy, faint, but unmistakable. It radiated from Lenara's body, and Evan felt it too, the strange sensation spreading through his chest. "The child," Lenara whispered, her voice filled with awe. She's aware. I can feel her." Evan's heart swelled with an emotion he couldn't fully explain. He wasn't just holding Lenara anymore, he was holding their future. Their child, a being that carried within her the power of both human and alien, a fusion of two worlds that had once seemed impossibly separate. "She's strong," Lenara said, her smile growing as the energy pulsed again, stronger this time. "Stronger than I imagined." Evan couldn't help the smile that broke across his face, despite the danger that still loomed over them. It was more than just a smile, it was hope. Fragile and tenuous, but real. The future they had feared was no longer something to run from, it was something to embrace. Slowly, Evan rose to his feet, helping Lenara up with him, their hands entwined. She leaned against him, her strength returning slowly but steadily. Together, they stood before the viewport, watching the stars outside the ship shimmer and shift. "We'll find a place," he said softly, his arm around her waist, holding her close. "A place where we can raise her, where we can be safe." "And when they come for us?" Lenara asked, her voice still tinged with the worry that lingered beneath the surface. Evan's gaze hardened, his jaw set with determination. "Then we'll show them what we've become, what she's become." Lenara's hand rested on her stomach, her fingers glowing faintly with the soft pulse of energy from their child. "A new beginning," she whispered, as if the words themselves held the promise of a future yet to be written. Evan pressed a kiss to her temple, his heart steady now, his fear replaced by something stronger. They had faced the darkness, and together they had survived. Now they would forge a new path. For themselves, for their child, for the future. As the stars stretched out before them, vast and infinite, Evan knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. Bound by love, by trust, and by the impossible bond that had brought them together. Together, they were no longer running, they were beginning.